Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today I'm going to be analyzing the finale of Schubert's 14th String Quartet in D minor, nicknamed Death and the Maiden. There are many common threads between this sonata form and that of the first movement, but perhaps the most notable similarity is that of a sense of denial within the music. Let's begin, and I'll explain what I mean. If you're familiar with Schubert, you know that, perhaps more than any other composer, his primary themes are often microcosms of the entire work, and this finale is no different. Before we go past the repeat, let's examine this music a little. You've no doubt noticed that I've put a second harmonic analysis in parentheses with 3 asterisks. As we move through this piece, you'll notice many asterisks. Just know that they represent a second possible interpretation rather than my actual interpretation. Or, in the case of this theme, really an interpolation. The theme is, I think fairly obviously, in D minor. And yet, at the points where the music should cadence, we instead get an implied F major and then an implied B flat major, which would of course be a half cadence and then a perfect authentic cadence in B flat major, the submediant, making this open theme structure a sort of quasi-period in that key. But we are not in B flat major. This is in D minor. So instead, the music must regather itself and billow out this primary theme section. In a finale, the Type 4 Sonata Rondo hybrid should always be near the forefront in terms of possibilities, but the repeats around the primary theme make it all but a foregone conclusion. In this case, however, the first and second repeats serve a narrative as well as musical function. This music must get itself together and attempt to solidify its tonic key, which so far is very unstable. As you can see, the primary theme does manage to open first a half cadence and then a perfect cadence before the repeat, which, in its second ending, will move into the transition. Remember, this interaction between B flat major and D minor in the primary theme area create a tonal backdrop that will influence both the exposition and the recapitulation in this form. The transition section is normative and comprised of 2 parts, this rush of eighth notes and this rhythmic ostinato, which I'll ask you to remember for later, both of which provide clues as to the layout of the remainder of the movement. The good news is, we're right where we're supposed to be, in the mediant of D minor, which also happens to be the dominant of B flat major, the key of F, a fact which ordinarily would be completely irrelevant to an analysis. A con forza melody, which will reappear several times, all labeled as 1 point something. Unfortunately, the theme is stymied immediately. Note the deceptive cadence which resolves the initial dominant C7 back to the original tonic D minor. Although the theme eventually reaches a perfect authentic cadence, the music, perhaps remembering the internal struggle between D minor and F major, is unwilling to move on. That same secondary theme sounds under the tumultuous eighth notes of the transition, the rhythmic drive of the primary theme, and ultimately dissolves completely under the quarter-eighth dotted quarter rhythmic motif of the initial transition. It's difficult to label the sections of the sonata form as they continue, but just know that it's possible to think of this entire section as a second transition. This sonata form is, at least in dialogue, with the Trimodular block. If we are to regard this movement as a trimodular block, then this section is the first candidate for a new medial caesura. F major, clinging desperately to a more positive reality, articulates a deformational PAC medial caesura, but is rejected by the continuation of both the secondary theme and material from the transition, circled in orange. As the music continues, F major begins to lose its grip and cedes territory to the more deformational and tragic key of A minor. At this point in the music, another possible, and in my opinion better, candidate for a second medial caesura gives way to music which is distinct from both the previous transition and secondary theme. However, I'm not sure the trimodular block is really the best way to think of this exposition. Academics such as Graham Hunt and Aaron Grant have both pointed to Schubert's continual use of the three-key exposition. In fact, this is such a common part of Schubert's sonata forms that for him it is actually a normative option. You may recall that the first movement of this sonata also had three tonal areas. On the very first page of Hunt's article, on the screen now, titled The Three-Key Trimodular Block and Its Classical Precedents, Sonata Expositions of Schubert and Brahms, Hunt writes that although Hepokoski and Darcy have brought clarity to the poorly defined idea of an exposition with three sections, the trimodular block, Schubert's use of three tonal areas is actually very rare before the early 19th century. Hunt points out that most pieces with a trimodular block articulate a second S theme in the same key, whereas Schubert often moves from either a normative key, in this case the major mediant, to a more deformational key, in this case the minor dominant. Or he reverses it, moving from deformation to normalcy. Hunt's article continues to lay out several distinct types of Schubertian exposition, even specifically mentioning the Death in the Maiden quartet in this chart, and noting that although it does have three tonal areas in the exposition, it is actually more unique than the other pieces in that it does not have a second medial caesura. This would make it an extremely rare instance of a three-key exposition which occurs outside the frame of a trimodular block. Although, as you noticed, I have labeled some possible candidates for a medial caesura in this movement, I'm actually inclined to agree with Hunt, which is why they all include asterisks. I would say this exposition includes an expansive S1 theme, which eventually molds itself into transitional material and then opens a new S2 without successfully articulating a caesura. Let me know in the comments if you think either of the options are actually convincing as possible caesura moments. As the exposition ends, the closing theme is morphed from A minor into A major, opening space for the return of D minor and the recapitulation of the sonata. Similar to Mozart's G minor quintet finale, this movement is also a Type 4, Type 1 hybrid type. Essentially, a Sonata Rondo hybrid without a development. Unlike the Mozart, however, Schubert includes an extended transitional link, a section of music that sounds as if you were pulling the cord of a motor trying to get the theme started again. It moves first in fits and starts before roaring to life. The music is veering off into B-flat major, unexpected and yet foreshadowed by the first movement, which also included a diversion into this key in the recapitulation. This is also where the foreshadowing of the initial primary theme of this movement comes in. If we think of this piece as almost having two simultaneous trajectories, one where the tonic is in D minor and one where the tonic is in B-flat major, which is essentially how the primary theme can be interpreted, this moment actually makes sense. In a D minor sonata, a typical, though tragic, trajectory would be a D minor primary theme and an A minor secondary theme, which we did have. Simultaneously, in a B-flat major sonata, we would expect to have a B-flat major primary theme and an F major secondary theme, which in a way, we somehow also had. Additionally, in a B-flat major sonata, we would expect the recapitulatory secondary theme to also be in B-flat major, which again, is what this sonata form gives us. I haven't come across this idea of tonal ambiguity being a driving factor in any of Schubert's sonata forms in papers or other writings, so if you're aware of any, please let me know. This is certainly something I'll be looking out for in future works by Schubert. But can the major mode be sustained? The risk of this bold move, so far from the initial tonic, but in the hoped-for major mode, gives the music a sense of denial of reality. Denial was, if you recall, one of the hallmarks of the form of the first movement of this quartet, and even a theme of the song upon which this entire quartet gets its name, Death and the Maiden. Both Graham Hunt and Aaron Grant mention the unfavorable view many theorists held towards Schubert's sonata forms until just recently. In fact, in the first paragraph of Grant's dissertation, he mentions that much of this view came from a comparison of Schubert's sonata forms to Beethoven, which is something that seems to exclusively happen to women and queer composers. I never see anyone compare Haydn's sonata forms to Beethoven's, but Ethel Smith is never listed without comparing her music to Brahms, just as Schubert is hardly ever mentioned without comparing his music to Beethoven. And what is lost by doing this is an appreciation of a different, beautiful approach to sonata forms and a recognition that it's both impossible to answer and irrelevant whether one is better or worse than another. One of the central criticisms made against Schubert is a sense of quote-unquote laziness in his recapitulations, that they either aren't altered at all, which is true, as Grant notes, many of Schubert's pieces do have relatively unaltered recaps, or that if altered, Schubert transposes two of the tonal areas down a fifth, thus allowing the recapitulation to play out the same drama as the exposition. This is all, as you can see in Grant's dissertation, the brainchild of Sir Donald Francis Tovey, sort of an archetypical great old man of music. And I hope it's clear that that's meant as a derogative. But what Dr. Grant notes, and what I also feel is clearly present in the music, is that this modulation away from the tonic is not a meaningless repetition, but an indicator from Schubert of just how far we still have to go, how much struggle is left in this music. Also, just factually, Schubert's recapitulations do not all work this way. The first movement of Schubert's Opus 99 piano trio, one of the very first pieces I analyzed on my channel, has an extremely deformative flat 6 recapitulation, essentially Schubert's own innovation. And if we're throwing shade at composers who don't alter their recapitulations, we're essentially tarring every composer except Haydn, who is the only composer I'm aware of who, as a matter of first-level default, alters his recapitulations. Okay, I promise I'm sliding my soapbox back under the desk and getting back to the music. The secondary theme is appearing in B flat. Essentially what we need to know is, will this key continue or be absorbed back into the texture of D minor, or find transformation into D major? As the theme continues, you'll also see it flirting ominously with G minor. Unfortunately, tragedy takes the day, and the music reaches tonal and rhetorical closure in D minor. In the first movement, you may recall that it was my interpretation that, although a perfect authentic cadence was reached, the continuation of the secondary theme after that cadential point erased its candidacy for tonal closure, and therefore resulted in sonata failure, which I, being only a little heavy-handed, tied into the Maiden's refusal to accept the inevitability of death. In the aftermath of the tonal closure in this movement, the C theme, though initially in D minor, transforms into D major, shooting through the cloudy resolution of the sonata like a sunbeam. It's not a triumphant ending, but perhaps it is an acceptance of a tragic one. Following the third and final tonic rotation of the primary theme, cementing this sonata's type as Sonata Rondo, there is a brief coda, which is a prestissimo flourish on not only the primary theme, but a simultaneous reappearance of the rhythmic and melodic material of the transition section as well. Adding a coda based on the material before the first medial caesura is another move of Schubert's that, while not exactly unheard of for other composers, approaches being a first-level default for him. I really hope you enjoyed my analysis of the finale of Schubert's 14th Quartet in D minor. I think many of us tend to glance over finales to long pieces, or at least I certainly have in the past. But I've been discovering how complex and interesting the form of many finales are, and I think this was no exception. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can join my Patreon, which gives you access to my Discord server, which has recently picked up an activity, I'm happy to say. And we are currently voting on what will be exclusive content to Patreon. So if you'd like a say in that, go ahead and join at any level. As always, if you have any questions or comments or see something you think needs a correction, please let me know in the comments below.